So I would say we will start now. A very, very warm welcome from my side. I welcome you all to our today's event, Health in the Anthropocene. My name is Maike Voss, and I'm the Managing Director of the Center for Planetary Health Policy here in Berlin. And I'm also, my other hat is Managing Director of the German Alliance on Climate Change and Health. And you will hear more of our work and what we do in a little bit. This year in June, the Center for Planetary Health Policy launched its work here in Berlin. So we said hi to the world and to Germany, and we published our very first policy brief, Health Within Planetary Boundaries. You will find the link also again in the chat box. With the event today, and within the next 90 minutes, we want to say hello to you and reach out to an international audience and experts, and to discuss what is needed for policies to be benefiting the public's health societies and economies to stay within planetary boundaries. So we want to zoom out and look on health systems especially. To do so, we have invited a fantastic panel and keynote speakers, and I will introduce them to you in just a bit. So today, we want to take time to think deeply on how health can be ensured and promoted in the Anthropocene. To do so, we will address the following questions, which are deliberately quite broad. The first one is, what kind of politics, research agenda, and social action is required to make planetary health agenda possible? The second is, what set of policies for health systems are needed in order to enable people and the biosphere to stay within safe and just spaces for humanity? And the third is, what does the future of health in the Anthropocene era imply for policy making, healthcare, and public health services? Some words on our agenda, what we are going to do, and on housekeeping. We will hear in just a bit a keynote that I'm totally thrilled about, followed by a panel discussion with, for me, some of the most interesting people in planetary health currently. Then my dear colleague Remco van der Pas will present our brand new think piece, the need for transformation to a post-growth health economic system, followed by a very short presentation on our work at CPHP. This event will be recorded. I think you agreed already by clicking on a button. So you will find the recording on our website and on Twitter and on the internet everywhere quite soon. I invite you also to put your questions and comments into the Q&A tool you find below in the Zoom. Feel free to raise all questions you have, and we will get to this in the panel discussion. And my goal is always, when I moderate, to make it as engaging and interactive as possible, also in the digital world. So please feel free to help me by raising questions. With this event today, this is as an opening event of the CPHP new webinar series, Planetary Health Dialogues, that we will kickstart today. And we are planning to have one dialogue either in German or in English every month. So please also watch out on our website or on Twitter to not miss anything that we are planning in the future. I think the next event is on the 21st of January, so please can also already highlight this. So without further ado, I would say we start with you, Katherine, and your presentation. Before you share your screen, I would like to introduce you to our audience. Katherine holds a PhD in social and ecological sustainability from the University of Waterloo, a Master's of Science in Medical Anthropology from the University of Oxford, and a graduate diploma in social innovation from the University of Waterloo. She is the co-editor of Health in the Anthropocene, Living Well on a Finite Planet, and has authored and co-authored multiple publications about environmental sustainability, health, and system change. And we got to know that you are you have written the new book that is in publishing, and we are thrilled to hear or get a sneak peek into your latest thinking. Katherine, over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here. I'm really excited for our conversation today. And as you said, my presentation is based on my forthcoming book, which is called Cultivating Human and Planetary Health for a Sustainable Future, which will come out from University of Toronto Press sometime in 2023. And this work explores the potential of community-based approaches that exist at the margins of health systems and considers how these might become unexpected solutions to the challenges that are facing health in the Anthropocene. I'm going to begin my presentation with a high-level overview of some of the key challenges that I think we're facing, thinking through the ecological foundations of health, the political economic challenges within the current system, and then some social ecological systems change strategies. I'll then give a few examples of promising practices and movements, and conclude with some policy touchstones for planetary health. So beginning with the ecological foundations of health, since the year 1950, all indicators of human impact on the biosphere have risen dramatically in these hockey stick growth curves that Earth system scientists refer to as the Great Acceleration. During the Great Acceleration, human populations, national GDPs, energy use have all followed this extreme upward trajectory that are mirrored in Earth system's trends, like a rise in atmospheric carbon dioxide and surface temperatures. So the result is that human activities are now the dominant driver of changes to Earth systems. So we find ourselves in a paradoxical situation when it comes to human and planetary health. Since the beginning of the Great Acceleration in 1950, 53% of the global population has been lifted out of extreme poverty. The average life expectancy has risen by 26 years, and the global infant mortality rate has fallen from 225 out of 1,000 births to 45, which is a five-fold decrease. And you can think about the impact that has on people's lives. So while these metrics of human health have steadily risen around the world, indicators of planetary health have begun to steadily decline. Ecological disruptions at a global scale threaten the planet's capacity to support human life in the long term, let alone human health. So while rapid economic modernization has been very good for the health of many individual humans, prioritizing the health of a single species over the health of the nested systems that sustain all of us has had unintended consequences that loop back to negatively affect human health. So we're looking at dynamics like the climate crisis, mass extinctions, antimicrobial resistance, and the breaching of at least 5 planetary boundaries. So what we're seeing is that these human economic activities are pushing Earth systems across thresholds. And beyond these thresholds, we expect the systems to be less conducive to human population health over the long term. And this is because human civilization thrived during the Holocene epoch, which was an extended period starting at the end of the last ice age, where the climate was very stable, fresh water was readily available, and biodiversity was extremely abundant. The Anthropocene, in contrast, is now characterized by the climate crisis, rising temperatures, ocean acidification, and the decimation of biodiversity. So it's unclear what the prospects are for human health under such conditions. But what is clear is that securing a healthy future for humanity depends on our capacity to also secure planetary health. But doing so is beyond the scope of health systems alone. It's going to require fundamental changes to the way we organize all of our complex social systems, the way we grow our food, produce material goods, transport them, generate energy, govern our communities, and care for one another. And in particular, regenerating planetary health is going to require political economic transformations. So that we are no longer pursuing economic growth as a means of increasing human well-being to the detriment of the planet that ultimately sustains us. So there's quite a lot of evidence to suggest that it's not going to be possible to completely decouple economic growth from environmental destruction, at least not on a global scale and not fast enough to deal with the urgent crises that we're facing. So at a global level, economic growth continues to be associated with greater consumption of materials and energy and greater contribution to climate change. But when we think about moving to a post-growth political economy, this raises some new wicked tensions. Modern scientific medicine is often thought of as one of humanity's greatest achievements. At the same time, it's very energy and resource intensive, it's high cost, and ecologically destructive if you think of, for example, its contributions to air pollution and waste. Problematically, it's also highly dependent on growth to operate, as it's often funded mostly by taxation, which of course comes from growth, especially given the rising costs that are associated with aging populations and the trend toward high-tech solutions and professionalized healthcare. So yes, economic growth is undermining planetary health, but moving away from growth could also be bad for health. When we think about downscaling, economic growth, this is going to mean reductions in complexity across all sectors of society, including modern scientific medicine. So we might see, for example, a reduction in the scope of treatments that are possible, curtailment of certain types of technologies possibly, and limitations to the professionalized care services that are available. And this isn't going to be a welcome change, and is likely to exacerbate existing health inequities. So what I wanted to do with my work was to begin to articulate what a post-growth sustainable health system in the Anthropocene might look like, and to consider what it might take to get there. So I focused mostly on what is possible within the community setting. So what can happen at the edges of health systems to take pressures off of healthcare so that the resources that do remain within modern scientific medicine can be used very strategically to address the aspects of healing where biomedicine is uniquely capable. So my work focuses on prefigurative practices, and the reason that I chose to focus on prefigurative initiatives or things that already exist now within communities is because there's research in sustainability transitions and resilience studies, which shows that building diverse alternatives before a system transforms can make it more likely that the system moves in a benevolent direction when it moves from one regime to another. So the prefigurative alternatives or the promising practices and movements that I'll share shortly embody the kinds of structures, worldviews, and relationships that could exist within a transformed society. Because they depart quite radically from the dominant regime, they're often very marginal currently, but they could rapidly gain ground if conditions shift in the surrounding system. So this diagram here illustrates the potential transition from the global social ecological system that we are kind of caught in right now, the basin of attraction of consumer capitalism that's been very durable and difficult to shift. And when we think about transition, we hope we don't move into a basin of collapse, but instead move into an alternative modernity, which is more sustainable, but that also preserves much of what we hold dear in modern society. So my book aims to demonstrate that encouraging the self-organization of alternatives for health and care in the community is what is needed to create sustainable and equitable health systems that can continue to generate positive health outcomes that we've gained through the transition to modernity in a future of more constrained resources. So I'll now move into offering a few concrete examples so that we can ground ourselves a little bit in what things could look like in the world. So the first is the soil health movement, which aims to restore the soil's vital planetary functions while working with the self-organizing capacities of living systems. So this is a movement that is occurring mostly among farmers. And the goal here is to cultivate a biodiverse living soil that's rich in microorganisms, bacteria and fungi, And doing so increases the resilience of local landscapes to climate change, sequesters atmospheric carbon, improves the water cycle, cools the land, makes land more resistant to the effects of wildfires. At the same time, in a more kind of direct way, it increases crop yields and the nutrient content of food and helps farmers make a living from the land. So improving soil health is an underutilized and very relational leverage point for building human health. And I think what's most exciting to me about this example is that it's by nurturing the micro scale that we have an effect on the planetary scale. And soil health is something that many people can contribute to within their own communities. The second example is the care farming movement. And this is a multifunctional approach to agriculture that brings together food production with health and social care. So some care farms offer therapeutic programs, things like counseling in an agricultural setting, but most of the care farmers I spoke to in my work were from the Netherlands. And for them, it's the daily work of nurturing crops, tending animals, and maintaining the farm that generates health benefits for participants. Care farm participants are very diverse, ranging from youth with behavioral issues to adults who are experiencing mental illnesses and addictions, elders with dementia, and people with long-term psychiatric conditions and disabilities. And care farms incorporate the skills and labor of these individuals who are often excluded from the labor market and full participation in community life. So participants at care farms will do things like fix fences, muck out stalls in the barn, plant crops, and work in farm shops. And care farmers talk about how it's the sense of meaningful purpose and relationships to orient people's lives that generates the benefit for mental and physical health, as well as social inclusion. So, of course, care farms are not claiming to cure illnesses that are experienced by their participants. The benefits depend on their ongoing participation, coming back to the farm, sometimes for many years at a time. And it's also this ongoing engagement that gives the model its ecological significance. So more hand work on the farm allows farms to maintain culturally valued landscapes, things like hedgerows that depend on people's physical work. And they also tend to transition to organic farms because people are working closely with the soil. So for these reasons, I think care farms offer a really promising example of the type of practice that can improve health across social ecological scales, from the individual to communities, local economies, and ecosystems. And the last example I want to discuss is the family foster care model for severe mental illness in Geel, Belgium. So this is thought to be the oldest therapeutic community in Europe, originating around 700 years ago and grounded in Catholic traditions, with a saint who was thought to be able to intervene on behalf of people experiencing mental illnesses. So pilgrims began flocking to this town. And the model is very unique for many reasons, one of them being that the family foster care model was initiated by the community itself, by farmers and tradespeople, rather than being organized by the church or health professionals. So in this model, families take in boarders with psychiatric illnesses and cognitive disabilities, and they become part of the host family in very meaningful and long-term ways. Boarders often remain part of the family for decades. The average tenure in the program is 30 years. This model is very non-medical, so host families are not expected to deliver a therapeutic intervention, and boarders are also not required to adhere to any medical regimen. Families instead take a common sense approach to care, and at the same time, they're supported by a team that includes nurses, psychiatrists, social workers, and these people check in on families regularly and are available around the clock to address any issues that arise. So the presence of these professional healthcare providers and a psychiatric hospital is very minimal in everyday life, but the fact that they're always there takes the pressure off of families and allows the model to persist. Those who choose to take part in this program are often connected to it generationally. They're motivated to participate because they grew up with a border in their home as children. And they're also financially compensated. Families receive around 500 euros a month from the state. Financially, this is about a sixth of the cost of hospital care and around half the cost of other supportive living programs. This model is recognized worldwide to be incredibly effective. Clearly, it's very culturally embedded, so it can't just be transplanted to another area, but I think it does suggest a number of principles, which are up on the slide, that might guide the design of other community-based approaches for health and care in a post-growth political economy. So the examples that I've introduced here have the potential to improve health, build inclusive communities, and at the same time contribute to regenerating ecosystems. They also all have a low economic and ecological price tag and could become key components of a post-growth health system. I'm not trying to suggest that any one of these approaches on its own is enough to ground a transition away from the current system to one that's more sustainable, but instead I'm trying to identify and bring to light practices that are already contributing to community health, inclusion, and ecological restoration across different scales. And these examples and others that I highlight in my book suggest some policy touchstones. I am not a policy expert, but I rather drew some policy principles from my work that I think countries like Germany and Canada could really use to invest in human and planetary health. So I think the examples in my work suggest that it's useful to invest in social change initiatives that generate benefits across scales, so that don't only focus on human health, but that also have positive implications for planetary health. Things that embody ways of thinking and being that disrupt the trajectories of the Anthropocene. So if you think of the example of the family foster care model, this is making a significant contribution, or sorry, a significant commitment to people and to the place where you live, taking someone into your home kind of for the indefinite future. And this is a commitment that really stands against many of our modern kind of cultural ways, which are much more mobile and transactional. And in that way, it disrupts the kind of system that we currently exist within. I think it's also necessary for us to think about initiatives that come at a low ecological and economic cost, and also that re-embed aspects of health and care work within networks of family and community reciprocity, because that is what makes them socially sustainable and not only environmentally sustainable. In terms of a few other policy touchstones that I'm not able to get into all of the background on each of these, but that I think we might discuss a little bit more in the discussion afterwards. Building health system capacity in prevention and primary care is essential in the Anthropocene. So we know that health care is responsible for a fairly small percentage of population health outcomes, estimated at between 5 and 20%. So prioritizing prevention and primary care might be a way to enable us to maintain the best of modern health systems, while also reducing the burden on health systems that's currently created by non-communicable diseases, and things that are a little bit more preventable with some with better public health initiatives, essentially. The next would be to address the social and ecological determinants of health. The WHO has estimated that social determinants of health account for between 30 and 55% of human health outcomes. So if we think about initiatives like affordable housing, universal basic income, ecological restoration, and poverty alleviation, we should be thinking about these as planetary health initiatives. Also supporting thriving networks of contextually whole health and care initiatives. And when I say contextually whole, what I mean is that they're grounded in the cultural, ecological, and historical contexts in which they arise. So communities and countries to look at what is working and thriving within their communities, and invest in those things that already exist that are supporting health and care, perhaps outside of the formal health system on the margins, like some of these initiatives that I've described. And then finally, expanding livelihood opportunities related to health and care. Degrowth scholars often talk about post-growth economies as being economies of health and care. So expanding the formal roles in areas like elder care, care for people with disabilities, care for children, and also acknowledging the value and perhaps increasing the cultural prestige around informal caregiving roles, I think will be very necessary in the Anthropocene, especially in situations where we're not seeing full employment. It will be really important to acknowledge the work that people do in their homes and their communities to care for one another. And that is, I think, where I'll leave things today. Thank you so much for listening. I really look forward to the discussion and questions.
Thank you so much, Katherine. Wonderful presentation. I have 100 questions in my head, but maybe let's go to the Q&A because there are already questions coming in from the audience, and I think usually they are more interesting than my questions. So I will read one to you. From your perspective, what kind of expertise or skill set would be needed to guide this kind of systemic change? Do we need more experts in post-growth or transformation experts or economists? Or is it an education and public global health sufficient to provide us with all the skills to co-create these changes? What do you think?
That's an excellent question. I think that skills in so many different domains are really essential to this transition. I certainly believe that the more people who understand complex social ecological systems and the dynamics that are involved in transitioning from one kind of dominant system to another, the better, and the more likely we are to be able to avoid some of the unintended consequences that can happen with systems change. And I also think that really cultivating change makers within communities is essential as well. Leadership around social change, social innovation, and things that are happening on a very small scale, to cultivate the diversity of initiatives and kind of homegrown, locally arising alternatives and solutions, I think is really essential. I don't think it's only about public health, although that is also important, of course.
Yeah, I fully agree. We are working a lot with the concept of change agents that we need in different institutions on different levels, but especially, as you said, on the local level, on the community level, who know the context, who have the trust of the people around them, and to usually know what to do, but just need a little bit of more knowledge, a little bit of support from other organizations. Maybe one more question. How do you think we can, in our current democratic system, get to a different system that embraces a post-growth logic or better livelihoods? These concepts always seem great in the abstract, but I wonder how we can take all the necessary small steps in the time to do something about the climate crisis.
That's the question.
Big one.
That is the real question, isn't it? I don't know that I have a really clear answer for that, because I think the our cultural dependence on growth is very ingrained. It's really hard to shift the mindsets. The idea of talking about economic growth as something that might not always be positive, even that it still remains very controversial. And so I'm not sure. I did think that the COVID crisis might kind of create some policy windows, but I'm a little bit less optimistic about that, I think, now. But in the early stages, you saw a lot of discussion around let's create recovery that is going to be sustainable and that's not going to replicate the systems that we had in the past. And perhaps there's still space for that. But I do think it's a huge challenge. Maybe some of our other panelists would have insight into that one as well.
Yeah, but that's an interesting thought. I mean, the World Health Organization did propose a green and healthy economy, green and healthy recovery from COVID-19. But the question is the recovery really used in a sustainable way? And is it built like that? But maybe we can come to this later as well. Katherine, thank you so much. I would like now to move on to the panel discussion, so you stay with us for this as well, and would like to introduce to you the other panelists. And maybe I start with you, Nicole. Dr. Nicole Redvers is a member of the Deninu First Nation in the Western Territories in Canada, and she has worked with Indigenous patients, scholars, communities around the globe her entire career. She is an associate professor, a Western Research Chair, and director of Indigenous Planetary Health at the School of Medicine Dentistry at the University of Western Ontario in Canada. She has been actively involved at regional, national, and international levels, promoting the inclusion of Indigenous perspective in both human and planetary health her entire career. Last time I have heard her speak at the World Health Summit this year in Berlin, I had chills all over my body because it was so touching what you brought to the room, Nicole. So great to have you. I will now introduce to you Olu, Dr. Olumide Abimbola. He's the founder and director of APRI, the African Policy Research Institute. His area of focus include economic formality, trade policy, regional integration, and natural resource management. He has worked at an GIZ-hosted G7 initiative funded by the German government and the European Commission. Before that, he worked on trade and regional integration at the African Development Bank. Olu has a PhD from the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Halle-Saale, here in Germany, and he has also a master degree in development studies from Uppsala University in Sweden. And I consider APRI a little bit the big brother of CPHP because your think tank is a little bit, but just a little bit older than we are. So Olu and I come to Olu a lot for advice on how do you manage things. So great to have you here, Olu. I look forward to your contributions. And last one, I would like to introduce to you Dr. Martin Herrmann. Martin is a physician and psychotherapist and initiator and co-chair of the board of KLUG, the German Alliance on Climate Change and Health. And he is and I can really say, one of the best bosses I ever had. He has consulted businesses, NGOs, and international organizations such as Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, on organizational and system change. He teaches at international business schools, at universities, and he is in love, I can say that, with complexity studies, and we share the admiration for philosophy and especially for Hannah Arendt. We can talk ages about this. So wonderful to have you all here. Nicole, maybe I can start with you. And I would really love to hear also your reflection on Katherine's presentation. And maybe you can start with that and maybe also looking a little bit on the first question, what kind of politics, research agenda, and social action is required to make planetary health agenda possible?
Masicho, thanks. Thanks for the warm introductions, and happy to be here with everyone today on an important topic, an evolving topic. You know, I was just reflecting as the previous speaker was talking about some of the community initiatives, and you know, I think we often underestimate the impacts of community and municipal level interventions. You know, often we like to focus in big spaces, thinking national, international, and forgetting sometimes that the most impact can happen at those local scales, while at the same time being very mindful on impacts in other scales through those local interventions. And really, I think that's one of the largest challenges of planetary health when it comes even to things like educational implementation is it's hard sometimes for students who are trained in very linear types of thinking to be able to conceptualize through their learning multiple scales. And what that actually means, not only from the standpoint of thinking through outcomes or what those outcomes might be in the measurements of outcomes, but also about the relationships between those things. So I was reflecting on a chapter that I've just written, and part of the chapter was thinking through the lessons that Indigenous traditional health systems could give to the world. And really, there's a number of fundamental principles that aren't necessarily explicit within the English language, at least within my home region's traditional Indigenous medicine system, but a lot of facets that tend to embody many traditional Indigenous medicine systems. And perhaps just by reading out a few of these points, you can see some of these reflected in the dialogues that Katherine was talking about. And one is that the world is inherently complex. However, we can absolutely participate in this dynamic nature of reality to affect change within ourselves and other systems. Relationships are more important than variables alone. An individual is always situated within the context of community and the planet. Multi-layered accountability mechanisms that span multiple scales of influence are always in place, whether we are aware of them or not. And holism is understood through individual, community, and planetary levels. So those are the points that I had put into the table, conceptualizing some of the main components of Indigenous traditional medicine systems. So maybe you can imagine some of the synergies with some of the case studies that Katherine was referring to. So what I'm always very cautious with in these dialogues is that when we think about these, alternative or sort of fringe kind of movements, is that these are us as Indigenous peoples. A lot of times this is our normal. It's not an alternative, it's us. And I think, even the way that we frame the language of it being an alternative, I always urge caution on that, because I think it sort of creates this separation between what and who we really are as a connected to communities, but also to our natural places. And really, these are our innate systems that many people for thousands of years have engaged with. We've just lost, we've forgotten, we've become disconnected as a part of that. And really, it's a reconnection process, not a complete transformation in my mind. It's reconnecting to who we actually are as human beings and members, small members of greater systems within the planet. Because there are very few cultures around the world 3,000 years ago that didn't understand the importance of nature. We've forgotten that. So I'll leave it at that, but just a few reflections based on the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Nicole. I just wrote a little bit, reconnecting relationships. I think, Martin, we will come to that. This is also a lot what we are talking about at KLUG and CPHP. But maybe, Olu, we continue with you. I would also, because I imagine this thinking is a little bit far away from your daily work, working on climate change and climate change policy, but I am still very interested in your thoughts when you hear this, and also your work, if this relates to your work with African partners. And I would also be super thrilled to hear more about what does this mean for partnerships? What kind of partnerships do we need with the African continent, for example, from a German point of view? Would you like to bring some light there?
Thank you very much. We've been doing this for years now, and I still make the mistake of not putting on the microphone. Thanks a lot. Thanks for the introduction earlier. You didn't say that the last person to come to the other was me coming to you for advice, so I should mention that right now. But in general, I should congratulate you, of course, for the center and for the great work you've been doing since you started. I'm selfishly very glad that you're in Berlin, because I'm looking forward to collaborating with you on Africa-focused things. So, first of all, that. So I'm going to respond first to the presentation we heard earlier. I think it was great to sort of do a very quick run through how much humans have done to the planet in such a short time. But I also was reminded of the fact that it's not all humans who have done that, right? It's a particular category of human beings in a particular part of the world who have done that. And so whatever we're thinking about when thinking about policy responses, even individual responses to this, and even activism around this. We have to remember that this isn't every human being cost, right? So I think that's important to remember. My second reflection was the idea. I think I like the way the idea of degrowth and post-growth was handled, because I think sometimes it becomes a bit difficult to relate to, especially when you're thinking from the perspective of parts of the world where economic growth is actually really important still, where development is still something people are hoping to achieve. And so again, it's important to reflect on this while we're thinking about a post-growth society, where is that society, and it can't apply across board. So how do we ensure that when we're thinking through all of these reactions, we're thinking through it from a point of view of justness of some kind, because it's really hard to think about all of this without coming up with the idea that we have to find a just way of dealing with all of this as human beings. So that's my reaction to this. I'm looking forward to the book, and it's great to listen to you. But sort of moving over to the question on what kind of partnerships should be created. I mean, I respond to this sort of thinking about what I've seen happen in the past few years. So we have the COP process, right? I was in COP recently, and my first COP was last year, and my feeling after the first 2 days was, really, this is how we solve this. But then my reaction then was to also think, okay, so if this isn't going to be the grand solution that's, or that's people that might have imagined it to be, what kind of possibilities exist to deal with this as moving forward? And then I started thinking through, okay, so if the COP is one avenue in which we need to have different people at the table to discuss an issue that concerns everyone, there have to be other avenues as well, where specific issues are discussed. It could be health related, it could be energy related, it could be very specific trade related around climate change are discussed, and maybe movements can be made in those spaces as well. So I think I'll bring that into answering your question, to think about, we have to think of new kinds of partnership, and new forms of partnership already exist. In the climate space right now, one of the biggest news from COP26 and 27 is the Just Energy Transition Partnership that was announced first in COP26 in Glasgow with South Africa, and then during the COP this year, but at the G20 in Indonesia with Indonesia. I mean, these ideas are essentially supporting countries to transition from fossil fuel use to more sustainable renewable energy sources. They are owned by the governments of the countries. They were created to address the specific issues that they are facing in the countries, and financing is provided by G7 in this context to them to support them in working through the issues that they need to walk through in order to actually have a transition. So I would think that sort of thing would also be needed if we're thinking about health, because we can't just think of it the way that we relate to it here sitting in Europe and in North America. We have to think of it, we have to bring ourselves to the frame of mind that accepts what people are experiencing in other parts of the world, the way they experience it, and then also listen to them for the solutions that they're already implementing. So like the examples that were mentioned in the presentation earlier, looking at those examples on the ground in African countries, in the global South, to see what those might mean if they inform policy. So adaptation strategies, essentially. What would they mean if they inform policy? What would they mean if they could be scaled? In some cases, they might be. In some cases, they might not be scalable. What would they mean if they could be learned from for other contexts as well? And also for our context here, living in Europe and North America. So how do we bring all of those things, all of those things in? How do we think of partnerships in a way that is more collaborative and also more reciprocal than just coming with ideas that we already have to try and implement in places that have shown over time that doesn't work? I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Olu, for your insights, and also for your recommendations how to do it better. Thank you so much. Martin, let's move on to you. I would also be very interested in hearing your thoughts on Katherine's presentation, and maybe also on what Olu just said on like what form of partnership do we need to really move towards planetary health.
My reflections in listening to you is, I mean, for the first part where you explained the background of planetary health, I would be a bit stronger in phrasing where we are, which is that we are currently destroying the habitability of our planet. So, and we are already kind of crossed a certain level where it's clear we will not go back to where we were 20 or 30 years ago. In the best case, we learn how to deal with the new situation. And in the best case, we are able to slow down kind of the speed in which the things are going. But if we move on like we do, we will destroy our home. And it's very clear, if you destroy your home, it's the most stupid thing you could ever do. So when we look at the economic changes, we need to stop the things that destroy us. I think that's a very strong case that we need to have. And I think in order to look for the solution spaces, we really need to own the diagnosis. That's something we know as medical doctors. We need to own where we are together with the patients and the families. And then we have a place to look at the opportunities and possibilities and what we can learn and what are the essential things to do and prevent. Now, with regard to the second part on the community and family-based solutions and things, I think that's very, very important, because at the end of the day, implementation always takes place within neighborhoods, within families, within networks, with friends, with, you know, in working places. And there is not one solution, because reconnecting to our sources means also reconnecting to the uniqueness of our given background and history. It means also to reconnect to the tradition also, but also to connect forward, to newly connect, to connect far beyond what we have ever done before. Because if we look into the fabric of our communities and families and friendships, the whole world is in it. So I have friends in Kenya, you know, my wife comes from Italy. We have not just the local place, we have in our networks and dearest friends, we have a lot of things outside. So it's not about going back to the community and closing down there. It's at the same time being open to all the consequences that are happening with our friends, with you in Canada, with our friends in Nigeria, with other places. Yeah. So this question of partnerships, I think that's at the core. Partners in understanding the situation we are in, and then partners in co-creating and developing with a lot of things which are unknown for us, because for you know, kind of through modernity, we have focused on productivity and we have not looked at habitability. So we need to really kind of park this obsession with productivity and growth and have habitability as a key thing, as a key criteria for everything we do, and then find out kind of what is possible and what not, and where do we want to grow and can grow, where do we have to shrink. In certain areas there will be more growth, in others there will be more shrinking. So I think there is something we have to learn. But what we need is partnerships also across kind of the fighting zones that have established over history. We need to reach out from small organizations to little organizations and have what I call improbable partnerships, which you would not expect. Because only through the diversity and friendships that we develop, owning what we are in, the predicament we are in, we can kind of be friends and close very fast. It's interesting if you interview people who have been helping in an emergency, who didn't know before, but then they were helping with each other for 10 minutes or half an hour or 2 hours. They get to know each other on the levels that you rarely meet people. So there is this chance to have a very interesting and good life by confronting and owning where we are at, and getting out of the dream worlds that most people are in, and also being proud on owning where we are at, and being the ones who are rational, because in a way, staying with the old patterns, staying with this overly focus on economies, the way we have done in the last 50 years, is completely irrational. It's really stupid and naive. And I think it's very important that we also, in the discourse with the public, that we take the high ground and that we are proud and open, but also very clear. And I do think, you know, all the questions of what can we do in communities and families and networks, it's very much at the core. If I look at heat, if I look at energy transition, all of it, at the end of the day, if we're not making it within villages, within cities, within families, if you're not learning how to take care of each other, really, you know, it's not going to happen. So it's very much at the core, but not the community, how we understood it from the past. It's really an open community. Our friends are now in many, many different places. And I have some very, very good friends that I gained through Zoom in Eastern Africa, for example. I've never met them, but we're very good friends. So it's also kind of, it's emerging into new spaces.
Thank you so much, Martin. I think now you know why I like working with Martin so much, because of his inspirational thinking. Maybe to share one story, because this is very much in me right now. I yesterday was at 4 or 5 hours from Berlin in a municipal area, meeting 13 leaders of local health authorities. So people working in the communities, in the public health system. And we talked about climate change and health and what they could do, or what they should do, what they need to do. And they got it from the very first moment. They know that they have to do something, but they are completely overwhelmed still with COVID. They are lacking resources, they are lacking staff, they don't find new staff, they don't have money to get new staff in, because the public health system was so weakened over the last 10 years, not really funded well. So they want to do something, but they can't. And living with this ambiguity is super difficult for them. They are basically paralyzed, even though they want to do something. So I think it's really also about talking about, in a high income country than Germany, about fragile public health structures and fragile systems here as well. Of course, in other countries, even more, but for me, this was quite shocking yesterday. And living like, and they were quite, it felt like, and COVID felt like a trauma to them. So it's like also really looking and listening to what they want and what they need. Before I talk too much, Katherine, I would like to continue with you, maybe also touching base with everything that has been said, and maybe also looking again on health systems and what is needed in order to enable people and the system itself to stay within planetary boundaries.
Yes, I think reflecting kind of on what each panelist has said, I think there were some really insightful comments and reflections. I very much appreciate the perspective, Nicole, around that these things shouldn't be thought of as alternatives. And the reconnection that is actually happening. And one of the initiatives that I didn't speak about today, but that's in the book, was around herbalism. And herbalism and learning about plants and becoming in relationship with plants as a way of reconnecting, especially for people who have lost any kind of cultural continuity with those kinds of traditions that would have been just, we would have all been embedded in some kind of much more place-based health tradition that would have recognized complexity in a kind of way that our current Eurocentric growth-focused economy is not. So really appreciate that perspective. And also the comment around it isn't all humans. I think that's a very important piece that often conversations about the Anthropocene are getting wrong. And I think I was in the book much clearer around that than I was today. So thank you, Olu, for that comment. I think that's really, really important.
Thank you so much. So I now look a little bit to the Q&A, to the questions that came in, and please, to the audience at home or in the workplace, please keep sending them. I will now have a look. Maybe this one, we touched on this a little bit, but how can we achieve the systematic change in regard of the great urgency of the ecological crisis? So Martin talked a little bit about urgency and like where we are right now, but maybe Olu, what is you're on the spot now. What is your thinking on like, how do we communicate the urgency and how do we get policymakers really acting? What is your sense?
Thank you. I mean, I haven't thought much about this. So what I'm saying to you is devolving in my head as I'm speaking it. So just bear with me. My first thing that I wonder about is it communicating? Like, is that the point? Is that the problem? Is it that people don't understand this? Because I think that people intuitively get it. I mean, you talked about the people you met yesterday who quickly understood what you were telling them. I think the point is people who can do something about it are not doing something about it. And I'm not sure that the issue for them is communication, but more about they don't see the urgency of responding to it. And so they don't respond to they don't see the urgency of doing something based on what they know and they've heard over time. And so they don't do it. Now, for me, I would reframe the question and say, how do we get those who can act, right? So the policymakers, but also the industries that essentially, behind the growth economy, so to speak. How do we get them to act? And I don't have a quick answer to that, but I think part of the answer would be, what are the potential pain points not pain points as in, how do you cut them, but what are the places where things one could press and then they would feel it in the way that would make them change, especially the industry, especially the industry. For policymakers, I think this is part of the work that you are trying to do at CPHP, to talk to the policymakers in a way that presents to them options. So one of the ways that I think, for policymakers especially, that I think we've been trying to work is to not just say that this is wrong, or maybe not even say that this is wrong, but to offer potential options for what needs to be done to them that are viable and that they can work with. And this, of course, also means understanding how they work and the realities in which they live, and the fact that we live in a democracy. That means that there are certain basic requirements that have to go into how we're governed, understanding all of that, and then coming up with potential things that can actually be done and offering it to them, and then maybe doing some advocacy around how to do it. So back to the question, I'm not sure that communication is really the issue. I think the issue might be how to actually get people to act. Getting them to act in some way would mean understanding where the potential areas that one can push that would make them respond would be. And then for policymakers, it would be being able to offer them policy options, and also being able to work with them to understand how they work and where the policy options are actually coming.
Thank you so much, Olu. Martin, I saw you nodding. I think you agree, but maybe you have more thoughts on this. Oh no, you disagree. Great, let's hear it.
I do disagree, because I think, yes, we need the policymakers, but what I think for systemic change, the most relevant thing is that more players are getting aware of their ability to act, independent of if you are high in hierarchy or low in hierarchy. So the guys Maike was talking to, there would be the question, given the paralysis they are in, how can they own the very difficult situation they are in? How can they take in the things that are now coming even from climate change and, destruction of habitability? Because that's a fact. We cannot go around it. And what I know, when we are taking in the situation and stay in touch with each other, and are not kind of losing ourselves in ourselves, then there will options will emerge. And I do think the most important thing is that more people are aware how much greater our ability to act is than we normally play out. And this is, if we're doing that, then we will also learn how to influence the policymakers, not only by giving them options, because in the directions they are looking, there are no options oftentimes. There's really, it needs a stop and seeing that the old game to a large extent is over. And that is very difficult for them because they have built their career around it. But we really need to be clear as the public to see, can we continue to move in a direction that is destructive? And it is not. And it's very important that policy makers understand that the wind is changing. We are changing the wind, and they need to start learning what it takes kind of to move things forward, which is really in a different direction. Because when you look to the past and to the COPs and all of it, there has a lot of discussion, and then we move on having more emissions next year. So the policymakers are not going to make the change that we need. We need to be the ones who are spreading the news, who are getting from, you know, more and more people involved, who will be creative, who will be courageous, and who will find ways to have solutions to the large policymakers, but also in the villages. In the villages, kind of the heat protection and, you know, the change in what we eat and so on and so forth. So I think that's by far the biggest potential.
Thank you, Martin. Nicole, Katherine, I have two questions for you, which I think are amazing. I will read them to you. Why I, the person who wrote the question, believe post-growth, degrowth are what we need to move towards at some point. I would like to see more discussion and around challenging these discourses and movements as concepts that are not every country and not every country can afford. Hence, are the ideas of post-growth, degrowth at risk of becoming new Eurocentric or Western hegemonic concepts? And following on this question I would love to hear from our panelists what words and narratives we can challenge the current economic system without using the words post-growth, degrowth, capitalism, but rather using indigenous concepts. Nicole, do you have an idea? How do we talk about this?
Thanks for the question on that. It's a question I get asked lots, actually. And you know, one of the things that's interesting is that there's nothing indigenous about our economic systems. You know, so trying to frame a terminology that captures some of what we're trying to do is a really interesting thought experiment. You know, there's been some indigenous folks writing on indigenomics, you know, sort of perspectives of bringing in indigenous value systems to how we think about relationships to our community, because really that's what it's about. It's about our communities. We can talk about planetary health, one health till the cows come home, but you know, a lot of kitchen dinners are talking about high gas prices and you know, the high cost of foods and all of these types of elements that come in. But at the same time, you know, it's one of the reasons I've been more and more questioning the use of the words or words like transformations, because I think truly, you know, people don't know really what that means. And I think that's part of the reason why we don't see shifts, is that even though there might be a recognition, there's a lack of true understanding on confidence on not only the steps to take, but the ramifications of that in all spheres of influence. We've seen economic crashes where one little thing creates spirals and all sorts of, you know, there's this sort of trepidation, I think, that occurs at country levels where, you know, there's a lack of confidence because we really haven't had a lot of investment into research policy around these spaces to think through kind of, if you drop a rock in a pond, what happens? The ripple effects come out. But, you know, what do these change mean in multiple areas of our societies? So it really, you know, comes down, I think, to, as I can't remember who stated it, but there is an understanding there to some level. Of course, it's different in different countries, but I think a lot of people are still a little lost. They really don't feel like they know what to, even though you know what to do, we're telling them they know what to do, but really they don't know what to do when it comes down to it. And that's the source, in my opinion, of the inaction, is, you know, that kind of key feature there. The part about, you know, growth in certain areas of the world, in our indigenous communities, even in North America, you know, we have on par health disparities with many global South countries, global middle income countries. Yet we are, you know, conglomerated into this global North kind of narrative of rich country. because of that, it creates this, inequity that's often unseen. There's an erasure that happens within a lot of North American, but also Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand, with the Indigenous communities that live there. And when I think about growth in those components, is it really growth that our elders are asking for? And I'd be curious too, because I've worked with elders in South America, Central America, and Africa, and I don't think I've ever heard anybody say anything about growth in the way of money for a community. If you ask them, the challenges of their well-being, what it is that they're looking for. Yes, opportunities, education, of course, comes up a lot in those community discussions. A lot of them talk about their values and wanting to keep their cultural traditions alive, their languages, and I wonder about that. Is it really that degrowth conversations are going to create inequities, or is it because there's so many inequities that if the same world mindset is going from growth to degrowth, it's going to continue those inequities regardless of whether it's degrowth or growth? I don't think going to degrowth is going to absolve all of the inequities. That's kind of an interesting conundrum for me. Does it really change growth to degrowth in a high income country sense the structures on the ground in low and middle income countries and in Indigenous nations? I don't think so, because it's often Western countries and high income countries that are in decision making about what degrowth looks like. So, it's kind of a loop conversation, but those are the things I've been reflecting on in the answer to that question, because I've gotten it about 3 or 4 times in the last 6 months. And starting to think, well, what does that really mean for my community? What does that mean for my elders? What does that look like in the context of their conversations and what their concerns are? But I will tell you that one of the most impactful things that happened in my region last month was an elder who came to a region. And he says, just very simply, he says, the muskrats are running around on the land in the snow. And this was, in November. And the whole room went silent. And, there was a lot of emotions that were shared. Now, if I told you that, you probably wouldn't have a clue why that was. But in that community, they absolutely know it's completely abnormal. In fact, that elder's never seen it in his lifetime. The muskrats running around on land in November. That's absolutely never happened in the history of his life. And he's lived in that spot for his entire life. So for all of those community members, that was a health indicator for them. That was a climate indicator that something was not right. And they got that. They got that very clearly. One sentence from the elder, everybody knew what that meant. So, it starts to get me to think about how these conversations are happening at the local level. Are we using the right language, even when it comes to indicators where it's not being understood? But when you talk about a muskrat in my region, everybody knows what you're talking about. They don't know about CO2 gases. Yes, they've heard about it there, but are they reading IPCC reports? Absolutely not, but they know the muskrat.
Thank you so much. This completely shatters my understanding of indicators, because I'm thinking a lot about indicators and what kind of indicator set do we need to really make change and transformation visible in the German health and climate change field. And this is like a new understanding of what kind of indicator do we need. Super interesting. Another thing that came to my head is, within my team, we have a lot of discussion on, are we on the right critical path? And we also next year invite Martin to really once a month or so come to us to really talk about this. What is the right way forward, the most critical path? And I think this is also a question that is, and my team asked me, can we come up with a checklist or with criteria? And I think this is, I understand that we all want this guideline, how to move forward, but it's at the same time not really possible to get there. A little bit looking at the time, I think we are doing the last round, and then I look forward to Remco's thinking, especially on the post and degrowth. Katherine, would you like to start with like final thinking? What is what you take from this discussion, and maybe also what would you like us to think more about in the future?
Yeah, I have been reflecting quite a lot today about this, the narrative around degrowth, post-growth, growth economics. And I think it's dangerous to assume that once people know what the right thing is, that they will then do that thing. That's kind of a standard fallacy, right? That people need to know in order to act. I don't know that the post or degrowth narrative itself is important. I think the discourse around health and thriving and having a habitable planet is much more important, and that sometimes these questions of growth, because they're just so anathema to the way people think, it just kind of gets in the way, that narrative. It makes sense to talk about it in this type of context when we all have a general base of knowledge, but I'm not sure that it translates well out into a policy space or into a community space in many contexts. And the other thing is I'm just very grateful to have been part of this conversation and to have heard all the reflections that everyone has on this, and it's very encouraging to see your work taking shape with the planetary health policy. So just express my gratitude for that.
Yeah, I can only give that back. Thank you so much for being with us. Olu, your final reflections on the discussion, and maybe also what's your recommendation for us to further think about?
Yeah, thank you very much, and I will also echo Katherine's gratitude to you for inviting me to join this discussion, knowing, of course, that I'm not a health person, a health policy person. But having said that, I want to continue along the same lines. Also, as Katherine has said, sometimes I think in this context, it's okay for us to go the growth / post-growth discussion. But when I'm in a West African country where the effects of climate change is pushing people out of where they live, nobody wants to live where they live unless they have to. When I see people don't have to be told about climate change, they live it, right? They used to be able to farm a kilometer down, and then they can't do that anymore. And when I'm having a conversation with a policymaker in that country, a finance minister, and telling him about some idea around degrowth, he looks at me and thinks, are you crazy? We need money, and we need economic growth to give us that money to generate the revenue that we need to do something in this context, or someone pays for it. And we've got to the point now where we see that the global society as it exists isn't willing to do anything close to, I don't want to go this fast to say like transfer financing, but isn't willing to do any of that. So the discussion when we're talking to people in those contexts is a lot different than the discussions we can have in this round, and also maybe in Berlin and in capitals in the global north. The discussions are different. So that's one part to it. And the other part is, I take Martin's point about people have power to make changes, but I'm also worried that this is some people have been saying this and using this to distract us from the fact that they have the power to make changes, right? So we've had cases in which it is, if we stop using nylon papers like petroleum products bags, if we are the ones who should stop doing that, and then we'll be fine. That's not the problem.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that we have an economic system that depends on that industry existing, right? And that we have an economic system that depends on people destroying things, essentially, right? To create money for us to sustain our livelihood in the global north, right? So while I agree that people can make changes and can push for changes, I will also echo what Katherine said earlier, which is that people knowing doesn't mean that they're going to do it. And even if they do it, it may not add up too much, right? So we still need the policymakers and people with power to make the changes that we need them to make. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olu. Nicole, your last words, and also maybe some hints and recommendations we need to further think of.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the words that we don't use enough within these spaces is codependency. And I think human beings have developed codependent relationships with negative structures, whether it's capitalism, whether or not it's, neocolonialism, whether or not it's all of these things, codependency. And I think back and I go, okay, well, if you're in a codependent relationship, I think Herrmann's a psychotherapist, if I remember correctly, how do you deal with that kind of issue? And trying to really think through some of the root issues and how we've sort of been encaptured as societies into these kinds of ways and really become dependent. And it speaks to Katherine's point, because if I get in a car accident tomorrow, God forbid, I'm happily able to go to the hospital, hopefully, to be able to have access to care. That is a right in my mind of human beings today in every part of the globe. If I have a sore throat or an infection, I go to the forest. And if you drop me out there with an infection, I don't have a stress in the world. But my guess is if I drop many of the people on here, you would probably be a little worried about that. Because I'm not dependent on the system. I know what to do because my elders and my ancestors have taught me what to do in those instances. It's the same for food. We've been completely codependent on outside systems for that as communities, and we've allowed that codependency to perpetuate itself. So when our communities talk about food sovereignty, when they talk about health sovereignty, they really talk about, again, that relearning, that reconnection, the regenerative living patterns that really have been embodied and taken away, at least from Indigenous peoples within many high-income nations, but also others as well that have been often violently repressed. And some of those lessons of who we are and bringing people that. I've never seen people transform, so to speak, without reconnecting some sort of meaning with their own lived experience in there. And those types of small moments of reconnection for people are incredibly important. And then the last point that I want to make is that I was at an interesting talk a couple of weeks ago with an international security expert who basically said that the conditions for climate change, the conditions for biodiversity, the conditions for all of these agreements are predicated on a state of peace in the world and a state of global order. And I thought about that for a little bit, in terms of what that means in this time of crises that we face and how we've went away from diplomacy. Because in our communities, we talk about relationships, which means if there's conflicts or things that exist, we learn how to talk to people that don't think like us. And one of the failures I think we've done as a climate change and health movement, others, is not engaged people that don't think the same way. In fact, we've pushed them away. They're deniers, they're people that, don't get it, they're harming our planet. But from a security standpoint, after a really interesting conversation and reflecting on our community perspective, that's not how we deal with problems. In fact, that is the time that we need to bring people closer and have those open dialogues and have those conversations, even despite people that don't, necessarily have the same frame of mind with us. There's a planetary health education special issue that will be coming out in the Lancet in January. I highly encourage folks, if they're interested in the research and the education sphere, there's some great articles coming out on that. So that's my last kind of bit. Masicho, thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So Olu, you here, even though you are not a health person yet, we need you. We need also other sectors and people with other training backgrounds to talk to each other in conflict times, but also in non-conflict times, I would say. Martin, your last reflection, what do you take home from this conversation? And also maybe some, what do you want us to further think on? Your microphone again.
I want to build on what Nicole was saying, but also Ola and Katherine, and kind of be strong on connect and reconnect, and connect in a way that we can have critical conversations, that we can have the space to talk about what really concerns us. Because when we have the space talk about what really concerns us, some of the patterns will inevitably be connected to the larger things we have been talking about today, in communities, in families, and so on and so forth. And when we can have these conversations, and when can we stay with the trouble of the conversations, over time, the ideas of how we can cope with it will emerge. So I think that's the most important thing, because I do agree when you really talk to people, it's not about growth, it's about something that is concerning them, that is concerning our livelihood, that is concerning kind of our relationships, that is concerning my care for my grandchildren and stuff like this. So if these things are in the open, we also find the resources or the ideas of the creativity to move things forward. And I mean, Maike, what do I wish for you and for the team and for this work, that you continue to be as dynamic as you are, and to reach out and to constantly learn with others, because I think already in the first year you have been doing a fantastic job. And you have talked about me being a good enough boss. I mean, I've almost never have had the privilege to work with such a talented and committed and passionate person like you. So to you and the team, really all the best for the work. And I'm very excited to continue to work with you and together jointly navigate the critical path that is in front of us.
Thank you so much, Martin, for your kind words. We have a couple of minutes left, and I basically gave the power to wrapping up and to commenting to my dear colleague, Dr. Remco van der Paas, who is a public health physician, worked several years internationally on global health governance and global health policy making and health systems research, and is senior research fellow at the Center for Planetary Health Policy. Remco, I look forward to wrapping up, getting all the dots and lines together.
Yes, thank you very much, Maike. And just to say that I'm still recovering from a flu, so my voice is a bit scattered, but that's what you have to do with it. I will refer to, I have one comment that I will make at the end, but I will refer to a policy brief that was released today on the post-growth transformation to a health and economic system, and how they, and this touches a little bit on what it builds on what Katherine was saying, but when you were focusing, Katherine, more on the informal care sector on the side of the system, we looked a little bit more in the formal healthcare system, especially also from a German perspective, and also there to come to the realization that these health systems, they are part of a built-in of an economic system that has solidarity on one hand, but a lot of economic and financial drivers on the other hand. And this has been mentioned in literature as uneconomic growth. So there's a lot of things we do in healthcare that are actually doing harm. It's doing more harm than we invest in it. About 10% of all hospital admissions worldwide do harm. About 20% of all healthcare activities are overuse, meaning overtreatment, overdiagnosis, pharmaceuticalization, and there's then a big environmental impact. So about the health sector is about 5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So the question is, it's indeed where to invest in. What kind of, and I would also not like to call it growth. I would like to call it more investment. What do we like to improve or enhance? Because growth in the medical sense, it's very much related to cancer. So it's also the word itself, which is a bit of a problem. Germany has spent about 12% or even more now after COVID on GDP. The USA is the most is the highest in the world with 90%, and we see how inefficient and inequitable and with poor care these health systems are. So any money that we pour now into the health system in Germany, will it lead to improved care or not? And the answer there is questionable, because it leads to a lot of medicalization and institutionalization, and we could invest that much more in primary health care, health prevention, decent public health institutes, etc. And there is international evidence from a lot of states with a much lower level of GDP, where states reach very decent health outcomes. Kerala, Iran in the past, Thailand, Rwanda, Costa Rica is often mentioned there. So moving to a health system that is less institutionalized but more basic, I think that's one of the things we can discuss and also learn from internationally. But also realize healthcare is the second largest economy in the world. It's a big driver, and there's a lot of interest also from financial actors in taking a piece of that growing healthcare sector. So there's big forces and powers there. I will end with that in the past. So we looked a little bit also in the economic models. I will not go into the details there. You can find it in the policy brief itself. But the most important thing there is there's a donut economics, there's well-being economy, and then there is the degrowth thinking, which in that sense is different because it sees itself a problem with the system as it is now. It sees a problem with capitalism and how it has driven inequities in the past, and how it has extracted a lot of resources to enable many countries to have the fiscal space to provide the health systems that we have now. So degrowth, difference than let's say the donut economics, I would say, is more looking also towards process of colonization, and talks also more about decommodification and shared ownership, etc. And in that regard, it links to the work by Ivan Illich from the 1970s, who was talking about the limits to medicine. So we should also, it's not only about how much we invest, but also how we transform the social organization of a health system. The good thing is the concept is already there. And us working in international health development, we refer a lot to the Declaration on Primary Healthcare from Alma-Ata from 1978. It was quite well thought through what is needed to attain an essential level of healthcare with limited resources, including connections with the community. And the question there is, if we would want to have a discussion also to move in a country like Germany to such models. Also there, then, from the international perspective, it's also about shared responsibility. I do agree with Olu that for a health system in Nigeria, you need to invest. The question is, who will invest there in the health system? You could, and there, it's always said that there needs to be domestic resources that can be used to invest in public services. But in reality, a lot of capital is fleeing away from the country. Our country, if we work on health and our policies, are European countries then able to stop those leaking and work on just tax mechanism, for instance, or think about a real sustainable debt structuring mechanism? So it becomes, in a sense, more complex, and not only the looking at it. It needs to be a development of a health system as part of a globalized world, and where there's a fair share of resources. Now, as Katherine also mentioned in your publications, also healthcare, whether we like it or not, will become less complex because there will be less resources for materials, for pharmaceuticals, etc. So we need to learn to deal with less and need to learn how to distribute that in a just way. And we need to focus much more on doing that in a localized manner. The good thing is that is possible, and it does not necessarily have to lead to poor health outcomes, but we need to plan it, and we need to democratically, in a deliberative way, start to think about where we want to be in 25 years from now, rather than that we let it overcome us in a crisis. So this is where the anticipation comes in. Let me end here by saying that we also had some questions. It's about how to do this, how to transform. What is the features of on economic growth in healthcare, what are the priorities and limits in the healthcare sector, and how to create a vision, is there transformative potential, etc. Lastly, and this is what this is what we should consider carefully, what I missed to talk about so far is the politics of the debate. In the end, where we would like to go, where we would like to see our health and ecological systems, it's also part of an international political agenda and vision and movement. So I will be quite careful not to mainstream such an approach across all the political sectors. Also saying that many actors, it's not only policymakers and politicians, but it's the media, it's professional movements, it's private actors, etc. How can we move to a pathway that is counter-hegemonic to where we are now? And I specifically say that because we are in very, very big trouble. Economic growth is killing us. We had it now for 2-3 centuries. And we can't reform the system anymore as we did want to do it in the last 20 years. So it's deeper, and for that we need to engage with the politics around it as well, in a deliberative, constructive way. But that would be my recommendation. Keep it here.
Thank you so much, Remco, also for bringing like new ideas where we can continue the conversation on the politics around planetary health, and also what Nicole said, the codependencies with negative structures. I think this relates a lot to the politics. Let's keep that in mind for further discussions. I had planned to show you a little some slides, but I skipped that because we are a little bit over the time. But I tell you just a little bit about the Center for Planetary Health and what we are going to do and what you can expect us to do. So I have a team of, Remco is just one of them, of very wonderful 16 people working with me in the Center for Planetary Health Policy here in Berlin. We have a very nice office next to the River Spree. So if you're ever in Berlin, please come by and say hi and get a coffee with us. Just some words on our vision and our mission, what we are wanting to do. Our vision is that we envision a world in which health and well-being are achievable for all, as ecological boundaries are respected and just and comprehensive social foundation exists. For the donut economic nerds among us, you maybe hear that we are using the concept of the donut economy and trying to bring this together with the concept of health. And we are rather talking about health within planetary boundaries than planetary health. This is our thinking has a little bit emerged there. As health experts, we want to contribute to the transformation of the German healthcare and the public health system by providing scientific policy advice. So we are looking at the science and communicate it, but we are also doing research on our own policy, applied policy research. We are focusing on the determinants of planetary health governance and the politics around it, and the relevant institutions, their strategies and actions, as well as underlying norms and values. So we are trying to dive deep into the governance structures. We can, of course, not close our eyes from the European and international level, as Remco just said, because the German health system and we are embedded in these policy contexts. We are reaching out to politicians, to policy makers, but of course also scientists and their institutions, actors in the health sector, which are basically delivering the work and being one of the most important actors in the system. And we call them multipliers, so the media or other people. What we do is we think and write about it, we analyze and write about it, and we talk about it in events like this, or as well in direct policy consultancy work. We are funded mainly by the Stiftung Mercator Foundation, which is one of Germany's largest climate change and climate research foundations, and we are very grateful for their support. And we are also part of the KLUG team, the German Alliance on Climate Change and Health, which is I would call the mother organization. You can reach out to us via email, via our website, via Twitter. by stepping by in our office if you are ever in Berlin. That would be wonderful. And yes, as I said, we are planning to have the next planetary health dialogue on the 24th of January in the afternoon, 4 p.m. CET, where we want to talk about planetary health and communication, even though Olu maybe don't want to talk about this anymore, but I think it's still necessary with experts in the field, in the research field of communication. Thank you so much to the panelists, to the speakers, to you, Remco, for wrapping up. That was wonderful. And yes, I think for now, that's it from my side. Thank you so much for joining, and I look forward continuing the very thoughtful, very fruitful discussion today. Thank you so much. Bye.